The 17th of October, 1814. London, the parish of St Giles, 4:30 in the afternoon. In a cellar on New Street, an Irish family is sitting with a coffin. The boy inside it was 2 years old. Neighbors have come to sit with them. A candle, a low room below street level, damp walls, because this is a rookery and nobody here has anywhere better to be. 30 meters away, behind a brick wall, stands a wooden vat 22 feet high, bound with iron hoops, the weight of a man. Inside it is porter, the dark beer London drinks by the 100,000 barrels a year. That afternoon, one of those hoops slips off. A storehouse clerk named George Crick looks at it and decides there's nothing to worry about. Hoops slip 2 or 3 times a year. It is routine. He writes a note to his superior and goes back to work. About an hour later, the vat tears itself apart. The escaping beer knocks the valve off a second vessel and smashes several more casks, and the back wall of the brewery simply ceases to exist. A wave of porter, somewhere between 500,000 and 1.5 million liters, depending on whose figures you take, goes down the narrow streets of the slum. It knocks over walls built out of whatever was to hand. It fills the cellars where people live. 8 people die, every one a woman or a child, because it is a Monday afternoon and the men of working age are out at work. A 14-year-old servant named Eleanor Cooper is washing pots in a yard behind a public house when the wall comes down on her. A little girl called Hannah is having tea with her mother. Both are swept away. 3-year-old Sarah Bates dies in another room, and 5 of the 8 are the people in that cellar, the ones who came to say goodbye to a 2-year-old boy. They drown in beer at his wake. Now here is the part that matters. The case goes to court, and the court rules that what happened was an act of God. Nobody is responsible. The bereaved families are entitled to nothing. A public subscription raises about £33 for all of them together. Meanwhile, the brewery petitions Parliament for a refund of the excise duty it had already paid on the beer that ran into the street. Parliament grants it, along with compensation for the lost casks. That refund saves the company from bankruptcy, and it goes on brewing on the same spot. Sit with that arithmetic for a second. The state decided that the lost beer had to be paid for. The lost people did not. And this is not a curiosity from the newspaper archives. It is a precise portrait of what beer has been to human beings for 11,000 years, something far too valuable to be treated as merely a drink. It was paid out as wages to the men who built the pyramids. Laws about it carried the death penalty. The church taxed it for centuries. The richest cities of Northern Europe were built on it. Governments have banned it, and governments have deliberately flooded their own streets with it. And both decisions were political. Today, a pint costs less than a bottle of water. You hold it without thinking about it for a single second. So how did the most ordinary drink on the planet turn out to be older than writing, older than the wheel, and possibly older than bread? And what have we forgotten standing at the bar? But this story does not begin in a London cellar. It does not begin in a glass at all. It begins in a cave where people buried their dead, 11,000 years before anyone on this planet deliberately planted a seed. Before we go any further, you need one idea, or the whole history of beer looks like nothing but a string of amusing facts. You need to understand what it was actually for. Grain has a problem. It is hard, difficult to digest, and turning it into food costs fuel and labor. Grind, mix, heat, bake. Bread is filling, but it goes stale in days. Now take the same grain and do something else. Let it sprout. Dry it, crush it, cover it in water, warm it, and wild yeast, drifting in the air of the room, arrives on its own. Within days, you have a liquid the body absorbs almost immediately. because the yeast has already done half the work your stomach would have to. Calories, sugars, B vitamins, amino acids. Cloudy, sour, barely alcoholic. Not what you call beer. Closer to a porridge that has started fizz. And it has a property worth more than flavor. It defends itself. Fermentation acidifies the liquid. Alcohol and carbon dioxide push out the oxygen, and a foreign microbe struggles in that far more than in ditch water. You have certainly heard the tidy version of this, that people drank beer because the water would kill them. Historians have been picking that claim apart for years. It is far too neat, and people drank water everywhere. But the mechanism is real. Beer kept longer than porridge, and it was food you could store, carry, and hand out. And once you can hand it out, it becomes something much bigger than food. This is the key to everything that follows. Grain in a granary is just grain. Beer is an event. It cannot be kept indefinitely, which means it has to be drunk, and no one can drink a batch alone. By its physical nature, beer requires you to gather people. It turns a harvest into a feast into an obligation, and an obligation into a hierarchy. You brewed and you invited, so now you are the one who does the inviting. Beer is the first technology in history for turning grain into power, which is why it will sit at the center of laws, taxes, riots, and prohibitions for the whole of recorded time. And it is why there is a hypothesis that still raises archaeologists' blood pressure, that human beings took up farming not for the bread, but for this. Mount Carmel in what is now northern Israel, Rockafet Cave. 13,000 years ago, roughly 5,000 years before the first clay tablets, and 2,000 before the first domesticated cereals. The people here are Natufians, semi-nomadic foragers. They do not sow, but they stay in one place for long stretches, reap wild grasses with flint sickles, and lay their dead on beds of flowers. Cut into the floor of the cave are stone mortars, deep, heavy, carved out of limestone, the kind of object that takes days of work and can never be carried anywhere, the kind that ties you to a place permanently. In 2018, an international team led by Li Lu of Stanford and Danny Nadell of the University of Haifa analyzed the residues in 3 of them and found something nobody was looking for. The wheat and barley in those mortars had been sprouted, not merely crushed, germinated. That is malt. After it come traces consistent with heating and then fermentation. 3 stages. Sprout it and dry it, crush it and heat it, leave it for the wild yeast. This is the oldest known evidence anywhere on Earth of human beings deliberately producing alcohol. And it was not made in a city, not by farmers, and not for pleasure. It was found in a burial ground, a place people came to bury and to remember. Human beings who had not yet invented agriculture spent days hollowing a vessel out of solid rock so that they could brew a weak, cloudy mash and drink it together standing over their dead. Notice that detail because it explains everything that comes afterwards. The first beer in history was not a foodstuff. It was a rite. But brewing for the dead once a season is one thing. Rebuilding your entire way of life around it is another. Southeastern Turkey, a hill called Göbekli Tepe, 11,500 years ago. People with no farming, no pottery, and no metal are cutting T-shaped pillars taller than a man out of the bedrock, carving them with animals and standing them in rings. Raising one ring takes hundreds of hands. There are no fields to feed those hands. And among the stones, archaeologists find limestone vats cut from single blocks holding up to 160 liters with traces of calcium oxalate inside. Beer stone, the residue left where grain has been steeped and fermented. Somebody here was brewing at what for the period is an industrial scale. Historians argue about this bitterly, and I will not pretend it is settled. But here is what is at stake. And the archaeologist Robert Braidwood asked his colleagues a question that sounded like a joke. Did man once live by beer alone? Wild cereals are poor food. Collect them, husk them, grind them, and the calorie return is thin. Giving up free-range and hunting for the brutal labor of farming, which the skeletons show meant working harder, eating worse, and dying younger, is a strange bargain to make for bread. Made in order to gather hundreds of people again and again to raise those stones, to hold the feast that binds everyone. It starts to look comprehensible. We may have had the order backwards this whole time. Not people began growing grain and accidentally discovered beer, but people wanted to gather and drink and tied themselves to a field in order to do it. I am not telling you that is what happened. Nobody can prove it yet. But hold on to the thought, because civilization may not have begun with bread. It may have begun with an excuse. 7,000 years pass. Southern Mesopotamia, the city of Uruk. Everything is here now. Canals, temples, tens of thousands of people, officials, taxes. And here, for the first time, beer stops being an archaeological trace and becomes a text. The Sumerians call it sikaru. They brew it from bapir, a twice-baked barley loaf made deliberately hard so that it keeps, then crumbled into water, with dates, honey, and herbs. They drink it through long reed straws from a shared vessel because the liquid is thick with sediment. On cylinder seals you can see two people facing one another, each with a straw in the same jar. The brewers are women. Brewing is one of the very few trades in which a Mesopotamian woman owns the business and keeps the money. And it has its own goddess, Ninkasi, whose name is usually rendered as something close to the one who fills the mouth. Around BC, somebody writes down the hymn to Ninkasi. Formally, it is a song of praise. Functionally, it is a set of working instructions. Dough handled with a big shovel, bapir baked in the oven, malt soaked in water, a fermenting vat that makes a pleasant sound, filtering compared to the rush of the Tigris and Euphrates. Scholars argue about whether it counts as a recipe. There are no measurements in it. Nobody argues about what it was for. If you are an illiterate brewer in Uruk, you do not consult a card. You sing while you work, and the song walks you through the steps. The first production manual in human history was a prayer set to music. And now the part this chapter exists for. Take the earliest cuneiform tablets, the ones that predate every law code, every poem, every myth. What is written on them? Accounts. So much grain, so many workers, so many vessels of beer, issued to such and such. One famous tablet, the Alulu receipt of around 2050 before Christ, records the delivery of best quality beer from a brewer, and is essentially the oldest surviving customer receipt in the history of trade. Writing was not invented so that somebody could tell a story. It was invented because somebody had to keep track of who was owed how much grain and beer. You are able to read it all because a clerk in Uruk needed to account for the beer. And then beer meets the state for the first time, and the state is immediately frightened of it. Babylon, the 18th century BC. King Hammurabi has almost 300 laws carved onto a stele of black stone. There are clauses about murder, about surgeons, about slaves, about debt, and a block of them about beer. A tavern keeper who waters the beer or who takes payment in silver rather than grain by proper measure, is thrown into the water. A tavern keeper in whose house conspirators meet and who does not seize them and drag them to the palace is put to death. A priestess who is not permitted to keep an alehouse and who so much as enters one for a drink is burned. Notice who is in the dock. In the Babylonian beer laws, the tavern keeper is nearly always a woman, and the sabbatum is clearly a person of standing. You can tell by how nervous the law is about her. So why is watering the beer punishable by drowning? It is petty fraud. The loss is a few coppers. Because what is being regulated is not the drink, it is the gathering. The alehouse is the only place in an ancient city where people who owe each other nothing sit down together, speak out loud, and are out of sight of the temple and the palace. The king does not care how strong your beer is. The king cares what is being said by the people drinking it, which is exactly why the clause about short measures sits right beside the clause about failing to inform. They are the same anxiety wearing two costumes. Remember that, because it is going to come back again and again, all the way into the 20th century. Power has never been frightened of beer. Power has been frightened of the people who assemble for it. Egypt, and here beer becomes money. Heracleopolis, around 3600 BC, centuries before the first pharaohs. Archaeologists find ceramic vats coated in mud and potsherds set over fire pits and running as a continuous operation. Chemical analysis of the residues turned up the expected cereals and flavoring dates and a high level of phosphoric acid, apparently used as a preservative. Long before the pyramids, Egyptians could brew in bulk and keep it. Then, in 1988, Mark Lehner begins excavating a settlement southeast of the Giza pyramids, the town of the builders. He finds bakeries, breweries, storerooms, administrative buildings, and a workers' cemetery. That discovery is what finally killed the school book image of slaves under the whip. The pyramid builders were conscripted and paid laborers, fed on meat, bread, and beer. You have probably met a figure for the ration, 4 or 5 liters of beer per man per day. Let me be straight with you. No papyrus survives recording the actual issue at Giza. That estimate is extrapolated from other sites, and it deserves to be held as an estimate rather than a fact. But the system itself is beyond doubt. An Egyptian worker was paid in food, and beer was a compulsory line in that wage, alongside bread. Not a perk, not a treat, wages. And then the Greeks arrive, and for the first time in history, beer becomes something to sneer at. The Mediterranean of the 5th century BC runs on wine. Grapes grow here, so does barley, but the cultural choice has been made. Wine is the drink of the gods, of the symposium, of philosophy and measure. Beer is what Egyptians and Thracians and other unfortunate people drink because their climate let them down. Greek writers mention it in the tone you would now use for a cheap substitute. The Romans take up the sneer. Tacitus, describing the Germans, notes that they make from barley and wheat a liquid distantly resembling wine, and you can hear the curl of the lip in the phrasing. The Emperor Julian, meeting Celtic beer in Gaul, wrote a small, vicious poem about how the real Dionysus smells of nectar, while this barley impostor smells of goat. Here is the joke, though. While the elite were writing epigrams, the empire was drinking. At Vindolanda, the fort just south of Hadrian's Wall, wooden writing tablets survive from the garrison's correspondence, and among them is a note from a decurion asking for beer to be sent for his men, because they have run out. Not wine, beer. And this is where something got fixed in place that is still on the map of Europe. In these centuries, the line hardened. The south, where the vine grows, means wine and civilization. The north, where barley ripens, means beer and barbarians. The line was drawn by latitude, then declared to be a line of character. 2,000 years later, you still half feel that a glass of wine is refined and a pint is common, though there is not 1 gram of moral difference between a grape and an ear of barley. It was never sophistication against simplicity. It was a climate zone, promoted to a personality. While Rome was sneering, the North was brewing. And there, beer held a position it held nowhere else on earth. Picture a long hall somewhere in Jutland or eastern Britain. Earth floor, hearth in the middle, smoke going out through the roof, benches down the walls. The Lord sits at the head. A horn goes round. This is not a party. This is the only functioning political institution for 100 miles. Among the Germanic and Norse peoples, the hall where you drink is the room where decisions are made. Plunder is divided here. Feuding families are reconciled here. Oaths are sworn here, and an oath spoken over the cup carries the force of law. The poet sings, and what he sings becomes the shared memory of everyone present. In Beowulf, the entire plot hangs on the mead hall of Heorot. The monster attacks the hall specifically because destroying the hall destroys the community itself. You can measure how deep this went by a word you have said without noticing. A wedding in Anglo-Saxon England was a bride ale, the ale brewed and sold to pay for the feast. That wore down into the word bridal, so every bridal gown and bridal suite is named after the beer at the party. The North used beer for what the South used the forum, and when Christianity reached the North, it did not fight that. It took it over. Medieval Europe, the 8th century. Charlemagne issues the Capitulare de Villis, an exhaustive set of instructions for running the royal estates, and among the craftsmen every estate is required to have, he lists brewers. For the first time in a European document, brewing is not a chore performed by the woman of the house. It is a trade with its own specialist. The monasteries pick it up. The famous plan of the Abbey of St Gall, drawn in the 9th century, shows 3 separate breweries, one for the monks, one for distinguished guests, one for pilgrims and the poor. 3 qualities, 3 products, 3 customer groups. That is production planning. Why monks? Because they have 3 things that nobody else has: literacy, time, and a requirement for consistency. A monk keeps records. A monk can repeat last year's brew because last year's brew was written down. A monk cannot afford to ruin a batch because the rule of the house and the table for the entire year depend on it. It is in the monasteries that brewing stops being luck and becomes technology. And monks have Lent. The rule forbids solid food, but it does not forbid drink, which produces one of the great ideas in the history of the subject. If you cannot eat for 40 days, brew something you can survive on. Thick, dark, heavy, made from a dense mash. Liquid bread. Bavaria still brews the descendants of those fasting beers, and one monastic Lenten style went on to found an entire family of strong, dark beers now drunk worldwide. And it is exactly here that monastic virtue meets monastic bookkeeping, because anything that feeds people will, sooner or later, be taxed. To follow the next part, forget for a moment that beer is necessarily bitter. Until the 14th century, across most of Europe, there are no hops in it. Instead, there is Gruit, a blend of herbs, different in every region, usually built on bog myrtle, yarrow, wild rosemary, and juniper. It flavors the beer, helps a little with keeping it, and some of its ingredients, in quantity, do noticeable things to your head. Now watch what power does with a herb mixture. In the 11th century, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV begins granting lords and bishops the Gruit right, the exclusive privilege of making and selling the blend. You may not gather herbs in your own wood. You must buy your Gruit from a designated house. Without it, you may not brew, and what you brew without it, you may not sell. Freeze the frame and admire the engineering. This is a tax on beer that does not look like a tax on beer. Better still, because the monopolist sees how much Gruit each brewer bought, he knows exactly how much beer each brewer made. It is an excise duty and an accounting system at once, and for centuries it was one of the largest revenue lines for the towns, bishoprics, and abbeys of Northern Europe. And then somebody noticed hops. Benedictine monks had been putting them into their blends since the 9th century. There are records of monastic hop gardens. In 1153, Hildegard of Bingen, abbess, physician, composer, natural philosopher, writes that hops, in her view, dry a person out and encourage melancholy, but concedes that they keep drinks from spoiling. The remark is made in passing. It turns out to be prophetic, because hops have two properties that together change everything. First, their bitter resins suppress bacteria, so a hopped beer lives not for days, but for months. Second, and this is the one that matters, hops are a weed. They grow along ditches, they belong to nobody, and they are not part of the Gruit monopoly. Do you see what that means? Brewing with hops meant brewing around the tax. The switch to hops, which took Europe 200 years, was not a change in fashion. It was economic guerrilla warfare. Gruit holders and town councils fought back exactly as you would expect. First, they banned imported hopped beer. Then, when the ban failed, they slapped a separate duty on it. And then, they gave up. The scar tissue from that war is still sitting in the English language. In England, ale meant the old domestic drink without hops. Beer meant the new hopped stuff coming in from the continent. Two words for one liquid are not synonyms. They are two sides in a tax dispute. A weed defeated a monopoly granted by an emperor, and on the way, it permanently rewrote the flavor you think of as the flavor of beer. But hops had a bigger consequence than tax avoidance. A beer that keeps for months is a beer you can put on a ship. Northern Germany, the 14th century. Hamburg has a river, a fleet, and connections across the Baltic, and now a product that travels. By 1376, 43% of the craftsmen of Hamburg are brewers. Not bakers, not weavers, not smiths. Nearly half the trades of the city are making beer. Lübeck in 1407 counts 174 breweries, most brewing for export. Hamburg beer goes to Amsterdam, to Scandinavia, to the Baltic ports. Hamburg was known, with justice, as the brew house of the Hans. This is genuinely new. Until now, beer had been local by definition. Brew it, drink it, watch it spoil. Now it is the first mass-produced export manufacture of Northern Europe. A good made not by nature, but by technique. Not furs, not wax, not fish. Processed grain with a weed in it. The brick town halls, the guild houses, the great churches of the Hanseatic cities that you see on postcards were paid for out of that trade. Beer was not merely drunk in those towns, beer built them. And now a chapter that usually gets skipped, because the more money there was in beer, the fewer women there were in it. Remember where we started. In Mesopotamia, women brewed. In Egypt, women brewed. In medieval England, ale was made by the woman of the household, and the surplus sold. She hung a pole, an ale stake, over her door to signal there was ale inside. A near-perfect trade. It happened at home, alongside the children, using what was in the house anyway, and it brought in cash. England's 13th century excise of bread and ale regulated price and quality, with official ale conners sent to taste and judge. The court rolls are full of women fined under it, for the simple reason that women were the ones brewing. Then comes the sequence. Hops make beer keep, so beer can be brewed in large batches. Large batches require big coppers, cellars, carts, and working capital. Guilds appear, and a guild does not admit women. Licenses appear, and a license is granted to a householder. A trade that had been female for centuries became male within 2 or 3 generations, not because tastes changed, but because it had turned from work into capital. You have probably heard the claim that the classic image of the witch is copied from the alewife: the pointed hat, the cauldron, the broom for the ale stake, the cat guarding the grain. Serious historians are skeptical, and there is no documented line of descent. But underneath the legend sits something entirely real. When the trade became profitable, women were pushed out of it, and those who hung on were readily accused of cheating, of loose morals, and of spoiling what they touched. It was not a change of taste. It was a change of owner.
1516.
Bavaria, the town of Ingolstadt. Duke Wilhelm IV issues an order the whole world now knows. Beer may contain only barley, hops, and water. Yeast is not on the list because nobody has discovered it yet. Fermentation is still assumed to happen by itself. You are sold this document as the world's oldest food quality law and as proof of a national devotion to purity. The reality is more mundane and considerably more interesting. First, a good half of the text is not about ingredients at all. It fixes what a measure of beer may be sold for by season. That is market regulation, not public health. Second, the real point of banning wheat and rye is food security. Wheat and rye make bread. If brewers buy them up in a good year, the town goes into winter without bread and comes out of it in revolt. The Duke was not protecting flavor. He was assigning grain, this to the baker, that to the brewer. Third, wheat beer did not disappear from Bavaria at all. The right to brew it was shortly reserved to the ducal family and its favorites. A ban for everybody turned out to be a monopoly for somebody. And fourth, the detail it gives the game away. Nobody in the 16th century used the word Reinheitsgebot, purity order. It came into circulation only in the 20th, when an old rule needed an attractive name and the German market needed defending from foreign beer. 500 years of purity turned out to be, in part, a very good piece of marketing about 100 years old. Not order in the service of quality. Quality invented after the fact, in the service of order. London, the 1720s. The city is growing faster than it can think, and among its hundreds of thousands are the men who move goods on their backs, the porters. They need beer that is cheap, filling, and exactly the same every day. So porter appears. Dark, firmly hopped, aged beer, named after the men who drank it. Its real significance is not the flavor. It is that porter tolerates long maturation in enormous vessels and barely varies from batch to batch, which means that for the first time in history, beer can be made not by the barrel, but by the lake. So London's brewers start building lakes. The vat becomes a boast. Whoever has the biggest is the most serious house in town. By 1763, there are vessels holding 1,500 barrels, and soon the count runs into the thousands. With scale comes measurement. Brewers take up the thermometer and the hydrometer, checking the gravity of the wort instead of trusting an elbow and an eye. In 16, Whitbread installs a Boulton and Watt steam engine, one of the earliest uses of steam power outside a mine. Brewing becomes one of the first trades on earth to be fully industrialized, measured, standardized, scaled, and mechanized. And in Dublin in 16 Pint, a man named Arthur Guinness leases a disused brewery and signs the lease for 9,000 years at £45 a year. 9,000. A man who at that moment owned almost nothing put his name to a document covering a span more than twice the length of all recorded human history. And there is no better single image of what that century believed about itself. Beer had become the first genuinely industrial product, identical, measured, made by machine for millions of people. They overlooked one thing. The bigger the vat, the harder the liquid presses on the staves. And half a century after the first giants went up, one iron hoop slipped off a wooden vessel in the parish of St Giles, and 8 people you have already met paid for somebody else's competition over size. But to understand why London clung to beer so hard, you need to know what it had nearly drowned in half a century earlier. William Hogarth publishes a pair of prints. On one, Gin Lane, collapsing houses, a pawnbroker, an undertaker, a woman letting her baby fall from a stairway. On the other, Beer Street, the same Londoners, fed, working, tankards in hand, and the only failing business in the picture is the pawnbrokers. This is not an artist's whim. It is government policy in pictures. Cheap gin had wrecked the city, strong spirit sold anywhere, killing fast. And the remedy chosen would look insane today. Not prohibition of alcohol, substitution of one alcohol for another. Beer was declared the drink of sobriety. The logic reaches its conclusion in 1830 gadu, when Parliament passes the Beer Act. Any householder may pay a couple of guineas, take a license, and open a beer shop in his own front room. No magistrates, no limit on numbers. Within 8 years, roughly 45,000 beer houses open across England. The state deliberately flooded the country with beer in order to drown the gin. That is the first clean case in history of beer used as a tool of social policy. And it is the same refrain again. Authority has always decided what you drink. Sometimes a decision arrives as a ban, and sometimes it arrives as a license. And since we are dealing with myths, let us do the most durable one in beer. You will have been told that the British shipped beer to India, that ordinary beer spoiled in the tropics, and that a special style was therefore invented, stronger, with a triple charge of hops, to survive the voyage round Africa. Thus, supposedly, the India Pale Ale. Lovely story, almost entirely wrong. Strong, heavily hopped, long-matured pale beer was brewed in England long before India came into it. It was called October beer, a country house drink that sat in cellars for years. Hodgson's brewery at Bow simply happened to sit near the East India Company's docks, so its beer went onto the ships, not because it was designed for the purpose, but because it was to hand and already knew how to keep. Porter went to India too, and arrived perfectly well. The name India Pale Ale enters common use decades later when the market needed a label, which is a perfect specimen of how food history works. First comes logistics, economics, and luck. Then a legend appears, recasting the accident as somebody's masterstroke, and the legend outlives the facts because it is more enjoyable to tell. The real imperial role of beer was duller and vastly larger. It traveled with the fleet, the garrisons, and the settlers to every continent there was. Wherever a British ship arrived, a brewery followed. That is how a northern European drink became the drink of the planet, long before anyone invented the word globalization. And then beer did more for science than most universities. France, the 1870s. Louis Pasteur, having shown that fermentation is the work of living organisms, turns to beer after the French defeat by Prussia, saying openly that he means to help French brewers beat German ones. His studies on beer appears in Richest. Souring is not decay in the abstract, but the work of unwanted microbes, and gentle heating prevents it. The method took his name, and you apply it to the milk in your fridge without suspecting it was worked out for the sake of a pint. Denmark takes the next step. The brewer J.C. Jacobsen founds a laboratory attached to his brewery, not a quality control department, but a research institute. There, Emil Christian Hansen solves the problem everyone had been failing at: why one batch works and the next does not. The vat, it turns out, contains not one yeast, but a menagerie of wild species in different proportions every time. In Richest, Hansen isolates a pure culture, the descendants of a single cell, and produces yeast that behaves identically, always. That is the birth of industrial microbiology. And here is the detail worth remembering the man for. Jacobsen refused to patent it. He gave the culture away free to any brewer who asked. An enormous share of the lager drunk on Earth today descends from that strain in Copenhagen. The strangest chapter happened in Dublin. An Oxford graduate named William Seeley Gosset joins Guinness. His problem is practical. Which barley is better? Which hops are worth the money? And the trials can only be run on tiny numbers of samples, sometimes literally 3. The mathematics of the day assumed hundreds of observations and could not handle it. So Gosset worked out the distribution himself. Guinness forbade staff from publishing under their own names, in case competitors deduced what methods it was using. And so, in Biometrica carried a paper on the probable error of a mean, signed Student. Take proper hold of that. The student's t-test is the basic instrument used today to assess clinical trials, vaccine efficacy, results in psychology, economics, and physics. Every time you read that a finding is statistically significant, you are looking at a method devised by a man choosing a barley for a dark Dublin stout who had to publish under a pseudonym to protect a trade secret. Modern biotechnology and the modern test of evidence both came out of a brewery, not out of a university, out of a factory floor. And in the same century, beer changed color. Poznań, Bohemia, the late 1830s. The local beer is bad. The townspeople are so far past patience that they stage a demonstration. 36 barrels of the stuff are rolled out into the square in front of the town hall and poured onto the cobbles. Then they do what burghers do. They pool their money and their brewing rights, build a modern brewery, and hire a Bavarian, Josef Groll, because Bavaria understands the thing that matters: cold bottom fermentation and long maturation in ice cellars. Groll brings Bavarian yeast with him. Waiting for him are 3 things that exist nowhere else in this combination: remarkably soft water, aromatic size hops, and very pale malt kilned the English way, with hot air rather than smoke, so that it never darkens. On the 5th of October 1842, he brews the first batch. On the 11th of November, it is served in the town's taverns. And the city stops, because the beer is gold. clear, lit from inside. Until that day, every beer in Central Europe had been dark, cloudy, brown, or russet, and drunk from clay, wood, and pewter, where color meant nothing. Then a coincidence lands that makes the whole thing possible. In the same decades, glass becomes cheap, and ordinary people drank from a transparent vessel for the first time in history. People saw their beer, and what they saw was gold under a white head instead of a brown mash. After that come the railways, then industrial cold. In the 1870s, Carl von Linde builds the first refrigeration machines for Munich's brewers, and bottom fermentation stops depending on ice and weather. Then Hansen's pure yeast and Pasteur's heating, which make the flavor identical anywhere on Earth. All the pieces lock together, and the world is swallowed by golden lager. Today, the overwhelming majority of beer on the planet, estimates run from 2/3 to well over 90%, descends from what Grohl made in a cellar in 10,000 Vasis Soroktva. Consider the price of that. For thousands of years, beer differed in every valley because it depended on local water, local grain, local herbs, and the wild yeast living in that particular barn. Within 50 years, all of it compressed into one flavor, reproducible anywhere. 1,000 local characters became a single global standard. And in the 20th century, the state came back for its share and made one last attempt to take beer away entirely. The United States, 1920. Prohibition begins. The detail usually lost is that the campaign was aimed at spirits, but the ban caught everything. The American brewing industry, built largely by German immigrants, is almost completely destroyed. A few survive on malt syrup and soft drinks, most simply close. When the ban lifts in 1933, only a handful come back, and what they brew is one light pale lager, because the ecosystem of local breweries is already dead. 13 years set the taste of a country for the next 50. In Germany, the beer hall remains exactly what the hall was for the ancient Germanic peoples, a political room. It was in Munich's beer halls that parties met and rallies were held in the 1920s. The attempted coup of 1923 entered history as the beer hall putsch, not because anyone was drunk, but because the plotters went where the city had assembled. 4,000 years after Hammurabi, nothing had moved. The state still was not looking at the cup. It was looking at the room. Now look at where all of this has arrived. According to the Barth-Haas Industry Report, the world brewed about 1,896,000,000 hectoliters in 2025, close to 190 billion liters. It was the second consecutive year of falling output. Only Africa grew. But the volume is not the interesting part. The interesting part is who. The largest company in the industry produced around 484 million hectoliters in 2025, a quarter of all the beer on the planet. The second produced over 12%. Between them, the top two account for nearly 40% of world output, and the 40 largest brewers for roughly 86%. Translate that into the shop. You are standing at a shelf of 40 different cans. Belgian, German, Mexican, Czech, something local and crafty, something with a monk on the label. The illusion of choice is flawless. Behind it sit 5 or 6 corporations owning hundreds of brands, including a fair number designed to look like a small independent brewery round the corner. 1 in every 4 beers drunk on Earth comes from a single company. The answer to that was the craft revolution. Over 30 years, tens of thousands of small breweries opened worldwide, bringing back forgotten styles, local water, strange yeasts, and herbal recipes brewed without hops, the very Gruit the monopoly once strangled. A genuine return of variety. Also a market the giants have been methodically buying. And then there's the hidden cost, which is not printed on the label. Water first. A liter of finished beer takes between 3 and 7 liters of water, depending on the plant. Multiply by 190 billion liters a year, and you see why breweries in dry regions keep ending up at the center of fights over the aquifer. Barley second. In 2060, the journal Nature Plants published work anyone fond of this drink ought to know. Researchers in China, Britain, and the United States modeled what worsening droughts and heat waves would do to the world barley crop. Average yield losses run from 3 to 17%. In severe years, supply in countries such as Belgium, the Czech Republic, and Germany could fall by 27 to 38%. Under the harshest scenarios, global beer consumption drops by around 16%, and the average price doubles. In Ireland, by the author's calculations, it could triple. The authors are honest about it. A dearer pint is nowhere near the worst consequence of a changing climate. They chose beer precisely because it reaches people that graphs do not. And third, for 13,000 years the argument was about who owned beer. Today it is increasingly about what it does to the person drinking it, and no and low alcohol beer is now the fastest growing segment on the market. So power over beer has not gone anywhere. It has changed shape. First the temple that issued the ration, then the king who drowned you for short measure, then the church with its monopoly on herbs, then the crown with its excise, and the parliament that refunded that excise to a brewery instead of compensating the families of the dead. Now a handful of corporations, an earnings report, and a barcode on the can in your hand. 11,000 years, and the question has never changed. Who decides what you drink and what it costs you? Now step back and look at the whole road at once. We are used to believing the order went like this. First people farmed grain, then built cities, then invented writing, and beer turned up off to the side as a pleasant byproduct. Convenient, sensible. Possibly wrong, because the residues in the stone mortars are older than the first field, because the vats at Göbekli Tepe stand where there is not one grain of domesticated cereal, because the earliest cuneiform tablets are ledgers of grain and beer, because the hall where people drank was court, parliament, and church at once. Maybe it ran the other way. Maybe first came the wish to gather, the need to make something for the sake of which strangers would sit in one circle and become a community. And the field, the city, the ledger, the writing, and the law grew onto that wish afterwards, the way they would grow onto any desire strong enough. We have always taken beer to be a consequence of civilization. It is not impossible that civilization is a consequence of beer. Remember that the next time somebody tells you it is only a cheap drink. Remember the woman in Uruk singing a hymn to a goddess because the song was her recipe. Remember the worker at Giza who was paid in it, and the monk who lived on liquid bread for 40 days of Lent? Remember whoever first threw a roadside weed into the copper because weeds were not taxed, and never knew he had rewritten the taste of a continent. Remember the 5 people in a London cellar who came to say goodbye to a child, and the government that refunded the money to the brewery instead. And the next time you open a bottle and hear that short hiss, hold your hand still for a second. 4,000 years ago, a man in Uruk heard exactly the same sound, carbon dioxide escaping through a clay vat, and was certain it was the goddess breathing. He was not as far off as you might think. Almost everything you call your world came out of that vat. If you have made it this far, subscribe. There are a great many more stories like this one coming. And tell me in the comments which moment surprised you most. The stone mortars 13,000 years old? Hops as a way of dodging a church tax? Or the statistics that were born inside a brewery? I genuinely want to know which one got you.